This week, a 19-year-old shooter entered a Florida public school and opened fire, killing 17 students and wounding several more. In the aftermath, President Trump made this statement on Twitter. He said that he was committed to working with state and local leaders to help secure our schools and tackle the difficult issue of mental health. So the question is, are mass shootings mental health issues? It's a complex question, and I think that in the mental illness community, there is a knee-jerk response to say no, there is no connection between mental illness and violence. According to national polls, roughly half of Americans, however, believe that mass shootings are caused by mental illness. And in reality, studies show and prove conclusively that only 22% of mass shootings are caused by the mentally ill. Now, 22% is big, and you say, well, that is a big chunk. Maybe if we treated mental illness, we could take that away. The thing to keep in mind is that 1 in 4 people in America have mental illness. So 25% of Americans at some point in their life will have some form of mental illness. So if we say 22% of shooters are mentally ill, that seems pretty accurate for the representation of the population. So there's no obvious correlation here and absolutely no obvious causation. You can say, oh, that number is skewed because most people who have mental illness that account for that 1 in 4 people either have depression or anxiety, and those things, we say, don't lead to mass shootings. It's the scarier stuff. It's the OCD, the schizophrenia, and the bipolar. And that's what we need to be watching out for, is these people are overrepresented. Well, studies say no and no. In a 2016 study, they found that only 4% of people with serious mental illness turn out to be violent. Now, to be fair, there is violence in serious illness, and we can't deny that. Schizophrenics only account for 1% of the population, but 12% of schizophrenics end up at jail in some point in their lives. It doesn't mean that they have necessarily been violent, but they have ended up in jail for petty crimes, for, in a lot of cases, they're trying to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. They end up in jail. But if you are on the side of saying, this is a mental health issue and we should approach it as a mental health issue, then you have my blessing. Go ahead and treat it like a mental health issue. If we say we could have prevented 22% of mass shootings if we had just gotten guns out of the hands of the mentally ill and treated mentally ill people better, I say that's great. Okay, so here is my issue. I am schizophrenic, so I see things that aren't real and I believe things that aren't true. But there is no database in America that would prevent me from having a gun. In states where they actually do have regulations on people with mental illness and that being included in background checks, it is almost always that a person either has to be on disability and recognized by the state as having the mental illness. That puts them in a background check. And then also people who have been institutionalized by the courts. And that does not account for anything. Those regulations would not have stopped this shooter in Florida. They would not have stopped nearly any school shooters because they have not been institutionalized by the courts. Most often it is, in hindsight, we say, oh, that person is, as Trump said, mentally disturbed. And we say, oh, there were all of these warning signs and we didn't pick up on them. Now, if you want to say, well, let's address those warning signs, I say great, because the mental health issue in America is terrible. And we could solve it so much better if we had access to medical care and if we had cheap and accessible prescriptions, which we don't have. Remember, the stat that I always come back to is that mentally ill people are much more likely, statistically, to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of it. If we want to tackle this as a mental health issue, then do it. Call your representatives today and say, we want regulations on gun issues. Know that that is not going to solve the problem, because still, what do we do about that other 78%? But at least it's a start, and it would be good for the mentally ill to have access to these things. Anyway, I will see you next week.